So now that we know about this, like this is the current understanding of how emotions work, we'll talk about the brain and emotion, right? So before we talk about emotional circuitry in particular, I want to talk about specific three core concepts that I want to talk about. Our first is the level of complexity that we'll describe all of these systems in. The organization of the brain, the basic brain organization, which I touched upon a little in the last class as well. And last is the limbic circuitry, which are our core emotional circuits, right? So first, in terms of levels of complexity, whenever you study the brain, there are certain levels at which you try to understand it, right? This is also based on how our knowledge of the cognitive symptom or or psychological phenomena also evolved, right? So the first is at the level of the receptors, right? This is something we all talk about on a daily basis, that which receptor is activated, what is the effect of this receptor on the cell, which subcomponent is it binding to, which neurotransmitters are being released. So all of this is at the level of the receptor, right? This was one of our first how we came to know all about neurobiology of psychiatric symptoms in general, is based on the fact that certain chemicals seem to produce certain symptoms in the brain. So we sort of were able to study these specific molecules which cause these changes, and then further going into the chemistry of it and how they may act on receptors. So this is one level that we talk about. Second is at the level of the areas and the structures that are involved. So these receptors were traced back and said that also dopamine receptors seem to be focused on a certain area, serotonin receptors seem to be focused on a certain area, and these areas also, another manner of studying them was in the sense of lesions of these areas, right? That an amygdala lesion seemed to produce so and so symptoms. So we sort of intuit what the amygdala might be doing, or certain lesions in the prefrontal cortex produce certain symptoms. So what this might be doing. So this is at the level of individual structures. So at one point in time, we had this theory or mode of thinking that we want to isolate which part of the brain does what, right? It's a common question that even nowadays we ask, what part is responsible for the reward pathway, because we want to know those two names of those two areas which are involved in it. But our current understanding has evolved into the level of tracts, right? It's not these individual areas by themselves, but by the communication of these areas that psychological phenomena are produced, right? So most of these areas that we talk about, like the amygdala, like the frontal or the cortex in general, or the basal ganglia, all of these are basically groups of cell bodies of neurons. Only the cell bodies are concentrated in certain areas. We call them either nuclei, we may call them ganglia, whatever, and they all send out their projections based, that is their axonal projections to different areas in the brain, right? You can think of it like sending wires out to different part of the brain, and this wiring is what we need to study as well, right? How are these parts talking to each other, which parts are talking to which part, how long is it taking for one communication versus another communication, how many synapses are there in between, right? And of course we talk about it in terms of more recently, you can directly image these tracts as well. So you can see in this diagram, right, this is the cingulum bundle that you can see here. There are certain other white matter tracts that you see here. So do lesions in these white matter tracts cause anything? Can these white matter tracts be used for any sort of treatment or anything like that? And lastly, at the highest level of complexity that we talk about right now is in terms of connectivity networks. So as neuroimaging evolved further, as functional neuroimaging emerged, what we discovered is that certain brain areas seem to light up at the same time, even though they are not physically connected. For example, when a person is feeling fear, there might be areas, of course, the fear circuitry that has been described in the amygdala and all those related structures in the front. But there is some amount of activity in the cerebellum, there's some amount of activity in the parietal cortex, there's some amount of activity in the motor cortices, right? And these areas are not really connected to each other structurally, but these areas all light up at the same time. So now we know that most behaviors or most psychological phenomena are not cannot directly be understood in terms of this area does this or these two areas together do this or this tract does this. The brain as a whole has certain networks that it has developed, right? Based on the pattern of firing of these areas, we've given names to these networks, such as the default mode network, the executive network, the salience network, right? So now when we talk about a lot of disorders, a lot of phenomena as well, we talk about it in terms of, is there a network dysfunction that certain nodes in this network aren't functioning as they should be? or there is a gross disruption in the network connectivity itself, right? So this is a framework I want you to remember, not just for understanding emotion, but for most any psychological phenomena that you may be asked to describe. Like if you're asked to uh, describe the neurobiology of schizophrenia, for example, right? This is the level at these are the levels in which you can explain it. Like you can explain it in terms of there is a dopaminergic, there is a serotonergic dysfunction, that so and so receptors have been found to be involved, then so and so areas have been found to be involved. Then you can say that based on certain studies, certain white matter tract abnormalities have been found, or disturbances in these white matter tracts have been found. And lastly, you talk about it in terms of there is a increase in activity in the default mode network. There's a decrease in activity in the salience network, and such and so, right? So this is also the framework with which we'll be talking about whatever I at least teach you about whatever phenomena we get the time to talk about. I'll be following this uh, rough structure of explanation, right? Another key concept that I want to talk about is about brain organization, right? We had again touched upon this in the last class about how these brain areas evolved, right? Based on their order of evolution, based on their functionality in different animals, we can somewhat divide the brain into three basic components, right? So right at the bottom, we have the brainstem, right? So the brainstem is somewhat the boring part of the brain, right? It takes care of your housekeeping, basically, managing your circulation, managing your respiratory rate, things like hunger, things like sleep, things like basic arousal. All of these are managed by the brainstem, right? It's very boring, but it's also probably the most important part of your brain in terms of survival, because you may have heard, like when we talk about organ donation, the neurologist has to declare brainstem death in patients who are still alive but on ventilatory support, because if the brainstem has died, there's nothing you can do to make the patient survive now, right? The patient is unable to sustain his life processes unless his brainstem is functioning normally. So this plays a role in your physiological regulation. Right above this, or rather in terms of evolution newer to this, is the limbic area, right? So this primarily plays a role in emotions as well as socialization. So this is an area which is very well developed in primates or even in other animals which have a very significant social organization. Primates are, of course, our closest. We are primates in a sense, right? So in primates and in humans as well, this area has developed quite much more than you would see in, say, reptiles or amphibians, who are more solitary animals. So this area, since we are living in groups now, we need to have certain better skills to communicate with each other, and emotions tend to play a role in that as well, right? Even, you talked about the functions of emotions. For example, when you're sad, a lot of your the responses to sadness are geared so that somebody from your social group will come and take care of you. Your response to pain, for example, might be so that, such as vocalizing for pain. If you see reptiles, for example, if you have ever sort of seen a lizard who has been injured, for example, or even in larger reptiles like crocodiles and all, when they're injured, they don't tend to shout and scream and make a sound or cry about it or anything like that. So the functions of these behaviors is basically to call for help in the social structure, right? And emotions are also a necessity in terms of understanding each other's emotions, right? If you understand that a person in front of you is happy, you can do a better job of keeping them happy. If a person in front of you is angry, you need to know why this has happened. If a person in front of, I mean, a friend of you is a friend of yours is scared, you might want to know, why are they scared? Is there some threat to me as well, right? So this is the limbic area. It's called the limbic area. Limbic basically means limbus, that is at the margin. So at the if you see we'll see a picture of the brain later, so it'll be clearer. And right above that is your cortex, the sort of the latest part of your brain. And the cortex is something that even among primates is very, very, very well developed, especially in humans, right? Humans have the most advanced cortex of any animal that we know on the planet as of now. So what the cortex has developed further is for appraisal, the step that we saw in your theory of emotion, right? That simply feeling this emotion may not be enough. We also need to know why this has happened and is this appropriate or not. And second is for regulation, that now that I am angry, for example, I am in a group, I'm say we are in a department, and somebody say a consultant says something to me and I'm very angry at them, that triggers a lot of anger in me. Now because I'm in this social structure, I know that if I shout at them or if I suddenly go and slap them on their face, this is going to have repercussions for me, right? This is damaging to our social structure that we have right now. It won't be tolerated in our social structure, and I will be isolated in that social structure, or I may face consequences beyond that as well. So, what the cortex does is it appraises the situation in which this anger has arisen, and it tends to tries to regulate this anger as well, right? That I know, okay, you're angry, but these are the repercussions, these are the appropriate ways in which we can show this anger. So it sort of modulates your response to anger, right? Another important concept within this organization is that you'll see that these arrows are going both ways, right? This structure does not simply mean that the limbic area controls your brainstem and the cortex controls your limbic system, right? There is a bi-directional talk between them. Because the limbic area has developed much, much, much before the cortex, your limbic responses cannot be ignored, right? For a very long time, uh, in the field of neuropathology, there was a law. One of these neuropathologists basically came up and said that the prefrontal cortex also has a role in the limbic system, and he was shunned for it a lot. And later, it turned out to be true because we have followed this sort of Cartesian model of uh, you know. Uh, the mind being separate and the body being separate, and by the body, of course, all of these base emotions, sort of, hunger, anger, rage, lust, all of these were sort of considered to be bodily functions, that this is just there to sustain your body, whereas the mind is above all this. Like, there is a transcendental mind which controls all of this completely, right? The mind is superior to all of this, and this has been proven to be wrong on a almost day-to-day basis since humanity has come up with this theory, right? If you look, for example, abhi jaise elections are going on, very few people vote, or very few people are tempted by the cognitive uh, parts of it, such as, you'll have better roads, or I'll improve. For example, if a politician goes and says that, this so and so chemical is used in road making, in tar, which makes it bad, I will mix in XYZ other chemical, and this will make the tar quality better, so your roads will sort of be last longer, right? How many votes is that person going to get versus somebody who's coming and saying that these people are ruining your life, this other party has spoiled roads here, I will be the one to fix it. So now he's appealing to a very limbic emotion here, that, you're sort of, they're creating a rift in that group, that this person has wronged you, you're feeling angry towards them, and they are sort of saying, you put your faith in me, trust in me, right? I will fix things, without any sort of substantial evidence for that. But people get swayed by that to a great extent, right? Marketing, for example, if you are trying to sell a product, you're trying to sell a pen, and you show this pen and say that this is a great pen, the nib is made of so and so material, the ink flow is stellar, and all of these things. Of course, some people will look at that, all of us will look at that. But suppose I am selling this pen versus a very attractive individual of, say, both sexes, so that cover all bases, they come and advertise this pen, and they're saying that, because of this pen, they're sort of implying by their behavior that, very recently I saw an ad for Schaefer, that's why I'm saying this. Like, these two guys are on a date, like, this girl is waiting for the guy, and the guy comes and puts the box of Schaefer on the table, and the girl is immediately impressed, and they are like shown to be sort of in a dancing together or whatnot. So again, appealing to a very limbic construct about that. If you do this, I mean, if you buy this product, it will help you find an attractive mate, maybe, or it may improve your social standing in your community somehow, right? So these are all, like we said, the limbic system is developed for socialization. So it is not a very intelligent thing to trust in your intelligence, that I will not be swayed by my emotions, and I'm a completely cortical animal, I'm a very intelligent person, right? In fact, the less you're aware of the impact of these emotions, the more you tend to be swayed by them, which is kind of the crux of what Sigmund Freud also said in his theory, that the more you're aware of your unconscious impulses, your drives, the better you'll be able to live your life. Right. There's a very interesting book by Antonio Damasio called Descartes' Error, in which he describes this phenomena in a lot of detail. I've put it in your reading list later. You can see it, right? So this is the basic brain organization, at least when it comes to emotions, right? This holds true for a lot of other phenomena as well, but this is how we'll be talking about emotion in particular, right? So before we go into the limbic circuitry, because we'll be talking about a lot of terms, I want you to be at least a little bit aware about how the brain is organized in general, at least the parts of the brain, right? So I want our first years to participate in this exercise. Brinda, Shivram, I can see here. I don't see anyone else. So you guys take this. Okay, so can you tell me what this part here is, Shivram? You can see my pointer, right?
Yes, sir.
ये क्या है यहाँ पे जो मोटा सा है?
Sir, it's the brainstem.
It's the brainstem, yeah. So this entire thing is the brainstem. This particular structure, can you say what this might be? Swollen up in front, ऐसे मोटा सा पेट जैसा इसका.
Midbrain.
No, the midbrain is above this. So this is the, anyone else? Third year वगैरह जो भी.
Pons.
Right. So this is the pons. Okay. It's also known as the belly of the pons. That makes it easier to remember. So this is the pons. इसके नीचे will be the medulla oblongata. So what is this structure here above the pons? This sort of beak-like structure that you can see here. Brinda?
मिड ब्रेन है ये शायद.
जी मिड ब्रेन है ये तो, है ना. तो पॉन्स के ऊपर हमारा मिड ब्रेन आ जाएगा. सो मिड ब्रेन इसलिए बोलते हैं बिकॉज दिस इज द सॉर्ट ऑफ द मिडिल पार्ट ऑफ द ब्रेन एज वेल एज इट कनेक्ट्स टू द ब्रेन, द रेस्ट ऑफ द, इट्स आई मीन द स्टार्ट ऑफ द ब्रेन स्टेम ओवर हियर, राइट. सो जस्ट so this is the mid brain, and in the mid brain if you see this kind of curved structure on top, है ना, ये जैसे इसके ऊपर का जो पार्ट है, right. So this is known as the roof of the midbrain, which is known as the tectum, right. It means, it's just a fancy word for roof in Latin. And this bottom part of it, since this is the roof, this bottom part, I mean not this exact curve but this area in general, is known as the floor of the midbrain or the tegmentum. Okay, so this is the tectum and this is the tegmentum. So when you talk, for example, about the ventral tegmental area, so you're saying that there is some structure which is present over here. ये orientation भी एक बार देख लो. Dorsal basically means the top half of the brain and ventral basically means the bottom half of the brain, right? At least in this cut section, right? So when you talk about the ventral tegmental area, you're saying that in the tegmentum, which is part of the midbrain, there is an area in the ventral part of it. So that is your VTA or ventral tegmental area. Okay. What is there after this? Right. So this, so can anyone tell me what number 7 here is, what is labeled this shiny structure over here? Any ideas?
मैमिलरी बॉडीज कुछ है क्या?
Mammillary bodies ये है यहाँ पे 13 नंबर पे जो है छोटा सा, just mammillary bodies just in front of the midbrain.
Hypothalamus.
Hypothalamus तो मैंने arrow बना दिया ना, hypothalamus over here. तो अगर ये hypothalamus है तो ये क्या होगा?
Thalamus.
Thalamus होगा.
Right? So this, ये जो मोटा सा structure है, that is the thalamus. That is the relay center of the brain. Most of your cortical most tracts that are going above or below, like in either direction, mostly pass through the thalamus, including your special senses, except for olfaction. Olfaction is the only one which directly connects to the olfactory bulb. So this is the relay center, and just under that is your hypothalamus, right? So the hypothalamus is a very important structure in terms of emotions in general, and of course even otherwise, because of what the hypothalamus does is, can anyone tell me what the hypothalamus secretes? What we know it most commonly for? Hypothalamus transmits to the pituitary. A pituitary stalk.
Oxytocin.
Oxytocin will be secreted by the pituitary. What does the hypothalamus do specifically?
क्या करता है?
So it has
Releasing hormones.
Correct. The releasing hormones. I think Bhagwat said it. So the hypothalamus is basically your brain center for saying that सारे perceptions मैंने process कर लिए, अब मेरे हिसाब से तुम्हें ये हार्मोनल चेंज, ये हार्मोन तुम्हें रिलीज करना है, जो तुम्हारा स्ट्रेस रिस्पॉन्स है, जो तुम्हारे जो HP एक्सिस दैट वी टॉक अबाउट अ लॉट, नो, हाइपोथैलेमिक पिट्यूटरी एड्रिनल एक्सिस जो है, एंड इवन ऑल अदर मोस्ट हार्मोन्स इन योर body are controlled by the pituitary, which is in turn controlled by the hypothalamus. So this becomes your junction basically for activating your immune system, your endocrine as well as later your immune system from the brain, right? So if you see something stressful and your brain decides that this is something that is fearful, I need to activate a fear response. As we saw in the theories, right, that पहले appraisal होगा उसका, some motor responses might immediately come, following which there will be signals sent to the hypothalamus saying that prepare the rest of the body for this stress situation as well, right? So secrete your corticotropin releasing hormone, which will secrete corticotropin, which will secrete go to the adrenal and secrete cortisol, and बाद में feedback loop आके भी once the danger has passed or whatever, the hypothalamus also has a role in shutting down this response later, right? So this is your hypothalamus, which is a key structure that we'll talk about later as well. Right. So can anyone tell me what this large curved thing is in the middle here? White जो बड़ा सा ये दिख रहा है.
Corpus callosum.
Corpus callosum. So this is like I think it's the largest white matter bundle in our brain, which basically connects both your hemispheres together. So can you tell me what is this other arch that is? So this is the corpus callosum, you know, right? This is the splenium, this is the body, this is the genu of the corpus callosum. जो bend होता है उसको genu बोलते हैं. ये बीच में क्या है? इसके बीच में जो arch दिख रहा है तुम्हें?
Fornix.
Fornix है. Excellent, excellent. तो fornix का काम क्या है तुम लोग को पता है? Where does the fornix come into?
तो कनेक्ट करता है, I think इसको
हिपोकैम्पस को मेमोरी बॉडी से कनेक्ट करता है शायद.
Correct, correct. So we'll talk about the fornix also in detail. So it's great that you know about it. So fornix का मतलब है arch basically. एक आर्च बना रहा है इसके नीचे. तो ब्रेन तुम अगर अभी दिस हैज बीन कट टू अ सर्टेन डेप्थ, 3 आर्चेस दिखते हैं तुम्हें एक के बाद एक. एक तो तुम्हारा कॉर्पस कैलोसम हो गया, उसके जस्ट नीचे तुम्हारा फॉर्निक्स का आर्च दिखता है, उसके जस्ट बाहर तुम्हारा कॉर्डेट न्यूक्लियस पूरा आर्च में जाता है, मतलब दैट हैज बीन कट ऑफ इन दिस. ये अंदर जो दिख रहा है दैट इज द कॉर्डेट न्यूक्लियस ऑफ द अदर साइड. एंड उसके ऊपर जाता है ये वाला जो है बेल्ट जैसा जो कॉर्टेक्स जा रहा है, इसको क्या बोलते हैं?
गायरस है तो
हाँ, ये गायरस को क्या बोलते हैं स्पेसिफिकली?
Cingulate gyrus.
सिंगुलेट. हाँ.
Cingulate gyrus. Excellent, right? So this is the cingulate gyrus which directly communicates with this limbic. So तो ये सारे जो आसपास के स्ट्रक्चर्स है इन्हें हम लिम्बिक स्ट्रक्चर्स बोलते हैं. So there is no real delineation physically about what is limbic and what is not. It is just a matter of convention. जो पैपेज सर्किट तुमने सुना होगा जो सबसे पहले आया था, उन्होंने कुछ स्ट्रक्चर्स बोले कि ये लिम्बिक सर्किट है. देन लेटर मैकलीन, मतलब ही डिडंट यूज द टर्म लिम्बिक सर्किट, इट वाज जस्ट नोन एज द पैपेज सर्किट. देन मैकलीन जो है मच लेटर इन द अर्ली 1900s आई थिंक, he came up and said that all of these structures together form the limbic system. A lot of this hypothalamus हो गया, midbrain हो गया, I mean some parts of the midbrain, this all the nuclei that fall in this area, the fornix, some parts of the basal ganglia also, some parts of the cortex also, like we said, all of this together form the limbic structures. Because ये सब margin पे है basically ये area के. ये medial part है ना brain का, तो अगर तुम पूरे brain को देखोगे तो बीच में ये margin में ये सारे structures मिलेंगे तुम्हें. ठीक है, तो ये जो मोटा सा अभी ये कौन सा कॉर्टेक्स है जो तुम्हें दिख रहा है? दिस गायरस एंड सल्कस, गायरा एंड सल्का दैट यू सी हियर, दिस इज योर सेंट्रल सल्कस. व्हाट इज इन फ्रंट ऑफ इट?
कहाँ पे?
कौन सा लोब है ये जो बड़ा सा है सामने?
फ्रंटल
Frontal
फ्रंट, करेक्ट,
फ्रंटल
फ्रंटल लोब
गायरस.
है. ये तुम्हारा सेंट्रल सल्कस हो गया, ये तुम्हारा टेम्पोरोपैराइटल सल्कस हो गया, तो ये हो गया तुम्हारा टेम्पराइटल लोब, ये हो गया तुम्हारा ऑक्सीपिटल लोब. एक्चुअली टेम्पोरल तो उस तरफ आएगा, मतलब अंदर की तरफ रहेगा स्क्रीन के, यहाँ से नहीं दिखेगा. तो ये सेंट्रल सल्कस से आता है तुम्हारा ये पूरा फ्रंटल लोब. ठीक है, तो ये थैलेमस हो गया, कॉर्पस कैलोसम हो गया, फॉर्निक्स हो गया, ये पूरा फ्रंटल लोब आ गया. एंड अभी इस फ्रंटल लोब को भी हम फर्दर डिफरेंशिएट करते हैं इनटू दीज पार्ट्स ऑफ द फ्रंटल लोब. ठीक है, तो ये जो अब इफ यू नो द ओरिएंटेशन ऑफ द ब्रेन, इट इज क्वाइट ऑब्वियस दैट व्हाट इज वेयर. इट्स जस्ट लेबल्ड बेस्ड ऑन देयर पोजीशन. अब दिस एंटायर साइड ऑफ द ब्रेन इज द मीडियल साइड ऑफ द ब्रेन. इट्स द कट सेक्शन थ्रू द मिडिल. सो दिस एंटायर हाफ इज द मीडियल, आई मीन व्हाट यू आर सीइंग इज द मीडियल साइड ऑफ द ब्रेन. तो इसमें जो अब ये ऊपर की तरफ है तो ये डॉर्सोमीडियल पीएफसी हो गया, प्री फ्रंटल कॉर्टेक्स आई मीन, तो ये डॉर्सोमीडियल पीएफसी हो गया. अब ये नीचे की तरफ है थोड़ा, तो ये वेंट्रोमीडियल पीएफसी हो गया. और ये जो पार्ट है, दिस इफ यू सी इट इन एन इंटैक्ट ब्रेन एंड स्कल, व्हाट कम्स अंडर हियर इज योर द ऑर्बिट्स, दैट इज जो आंख के पीछे वाला पार्ट है, दैट इज वेयर दिस पार्ट रेस्ट्स ऑन इनसाइड द स्कल, जो स्फिनॉइड बोन है तुम्हारा. सो दिस एरिया ऑफ द फ्रंटल लोब इज नोन एज द ऑर्बिटोफ्रंटल कॉर्टेक्स बिकॉज इट्स रेस्टिंग ऑन द ऑर्बिट्स. एंड दिस हाफ स्पेसिफिकली इज द मीडियल ऑर्बिटोफ्रंटल कॉर्टेक्स, राइट, और मीडियल ऑर्बिटोफ्रंटल लोब. ठीक है, so these are the parts of the brain that you need to have some idea about. I think it's cingulate, cingulate missing हो गया. cingulate को भी similarly divide किया उन्होंने कि ये dorsal anterior cingulate cortex हो गया, ये anterior cingulate cortex हो गया पूरा. एंड ये जो पार्ट है इसे SGACC बोलते हैं कि ये जो जेन्यू है कॉर्पस कैलोसम का, दिस इज द बेंड ऑफ द कॉर्पस कैलोसम, व्हाट इज अंडर द जेन्यू इज द सब जेन्युअल ACC. ठीक है, anterior cingulate cortex. ठीक है, so these terms will keep coming back to repeatedly when we are talking later. So if you know where these are and how these are connected, because now if you see it in this section, it's quite obvious कि अगर लिम्बिक सिस्टम को किसी से बात करना है फ्रंट साइड में ब्रेन के, these are the structures which are most accessible to it. ऐसे घूम के DLPFC से communicate करना तो मुश्किल है उसके लिए, because DLPFC is on the other side of it. So these parts also are often considered to be parts of your limbic circuitry. ठीक है, especially your ventromedial prefrontal cortex, your medial orbitofrontal cortex, and the anterior cingulate cortex in whole. So this also forms your limbic circuitry. Now within this there are a bunch of structures which are cut off actually in this section. We'll talk about them in detail. So is everyone clear about this brain organization? Any doubts about this? First year especially? कि बाद में तुम लोग overwhelmed ना हो जाओ if we are repeatedly, I mean most books also tend to use the same few abbreviations repeatedly कि DLPFC, DMPFC, VMPFC, MOFC ऐसे. तो ये एक बार orientation तुम्हारे मन में होना चाहिए कि क्या कहाँ पे है. ठीक है. So now we'll come to the limbic circuitry in whole, right? The basic structures and connections. So if you try to look up the connectivity of the limbic circuitry, so these parts that we've already seen and a few more that we'll see, ये parts में there is no doubt that these all are part of the limbic system, right? But like we said, the next level of complexity in brain organization will be to see the circuitry, how they communicate with each other. And this is extremely complicated in the limbic system, right? That's why a lot of people still only talk about the Papez circuit, because that is the simplest thing to understand. They just say एक loop में जा रहा है चीजें और कुछ है नहीं, बड़ा आसानी से this is how emotion and memory process in your brain, right? But it's not that simple, unfortunately. And in fact, the more and more we know, the more and more structures are, more and more connections are added to this circuitry. So what I'll try to do is, I'll try to sort of draw it out for you here, and then so that when we talk about it in detail, they may make a little more sense. So we'll start with the structures that we've already talked about. Prefrontal cortex हो गया, anterior cingulate cortex हो गया, thalamus and hypothalamus हो गया. ठीक है. So a few structures that we'll be talking about today include the amygdala, which is every psychiatry resident's favorite part. कि कोई भी पूछ लो कि which parts are involved in XYZ pathology, you can always say the amygdala and the frontal cortex without hesitation, because they're involved in more or less everything, right? The hippocampus, so I've made this, we'll talk about why it's shaped like that later. The septum, so the right behind the corpus callosum, where there is where both the ventricles sort of meet, right? So that part, the middle part, is known as the septum, or the septum pellucidum is the layer that separates these two ventricles. And there are a bunch of nuclei around the septum pellucidum, so they are just called the septum or the septal nuclei, right? It's a bunch of nuclei, not a single one over there. And of course, our favorite structures, the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area, which is part of our reward circuitry, right? So how do these structures talk to each other and how do these connect to each other? We'll try to see. Before talking about how they individually connect, what you should know in general is that, like we said, the hypothalamus is your final output pathway, and the basal ganglia for motor, and the hypothalamus for your all of your endocrine and neuroendocrine neuroimmunological responses, right? So first of all of your limbic structures, the basic point of all of these limbic structures is that they are trying to tell the hypothalamus what to do. ठीक है, सब hypothalamus को बोल रहे तू ये कर, नहीं तू ऐसे कर, नहीं तू वैसे कर. All of them are trying to make the hypothalamus do what they think is right, right? So this also implies that all of these structures also try to talk to each other to say, no, you don't tell the hypothalamus what to do. Let the hypothalamus listen to me, right? So all of these structures are mutually inhibitory to each other, and almost all of these structures are stimulatory at the hypothalamus, right? So this is the basic organization of the limbic structures. ठीक है. So how do these structures go about this? So this is the ultimate goal of all structures कि कैसे तो भी करके घूम फिर के हमें hypothalamus में पहुंचना है. ठीक है. अब ये कैसे करते हैं ये? ठीक है. तो we'll start with the amygdala because that is everyone's favorite structure. So in the theory of emotion that we saw earlier, we said that there are certain brain structures which help in appraisal, right? That whenever there is a stimulus, external or internal, this is brought to the brain by your sensory apparatus, and the brain tries to make sense of this. That is this positive, is this negative, and is this something that should arouse me, is this something that should not arouse me, right? So the amygdala plays a crucial role in this, in all emotional appraisal. We'll see later about the overlap between these areas, right? Along with the prefrontal cortex, of course, right? So, pehle amygdala ke there are certain fibers which I'll change the color, which directly go from the amygdala to the hypothalamus, right? So the amygdala has received all these inputs from your sense organs or from whatever levels of sensory processing, and the amygdala is trying to tell the hypothalamus what to do, right? So for this, the amygdala also needs to communicate with the hippocampus. Ki memory based bhi to dekhna hai usse. Is this something that I remember to be? Uh, what is the emotional balance based on my past experiences? For this, it also needs to communicate with the prefrontal cortex. That do I the evaluation, the calculation that may be needed for this, right? The amygdala also responds, connects to the ventral tegmental area. If it is a good, if it appraises it to be something positive, then it sends a reward signal. If it is something that is negative, then it sends an anti-reward signal, ki stop dopamine processing. And of course, the thalamus will also connect to this because all of your sensory inputs, as well as the motor outputs that the amygdala will send out to your motor structures, all of them will be passing through the thalamus. Right? So all of this together form something known as the amygdalofugal pathway. Right? All of these structures together are known as the amygdalofugal pathways, rather, in plural. Fugal matlab amygdala se bhag raha hai. So these are rapid response pathways. Ki amygdala gets these inputs rapidly and the amygdala sends out these inputs rapidly. So the classic example of you see a tiger in front of you, you need to run immediately. So this is managed by the amygdala. Right. Now this life would be very easy if that is the only thing the amygdala would do. But the amygdala also has another way of communicating with the hypothalamus, which is known as the stria terminalis. So ye itna सीधा amygdala, you saw how close the amygdala is to the hypothalamus, but it does not choose to do that. Another major pathway that the amygdala chooses to communicate with the hypothalamus is the striae terminalis. So it sends out a long projection going around the hippocampus and finally reaching the hypothalamus, septum, and certain other areas as well. Okay, we'll see about that later, right? So this is because evolutionarily at some point the amygdala and hypothalamus were close to each other, then the hypothalamus sort of rotated around the brain to come back near it. So this pathway that was once close to the amygdala, but once was very close to the amygdala and hypothalamus, has now become like this loop. So ये जो हमने fornix देखा था, so this arch basically I've tried to draw diagrammatic representation of the fornix. So it runs along the fornix of the hippocampus and it sends out these fibers to the hypothalamus as well as to the septum. Just see if I have, there are mammillary bodies, there's a habinula, all of these structures are also there around here somewhere. We'll see that later, right? So this sends it via this. Ab iska kya role hai ki the stria terminalis, where it comes to rest here at the end of the fornix, there are a bunch of nuclei here, which it communicates with directly as well and which also sort of process information and send it forward. So these nuclei in this area are known as the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. कि ऐसे लग रहा है कि stria terminalis घूम फिर के आके यहाँ पे rest कर रहा है. So this is known as the bed nucleus, right? The abbreviation that you may have commonly heard is the BNST. Okay, bed nucleus of stria terminalis, because this part has been shown to play a significant role in anxiety specifically. Right. So what the amygdala is doing via its amygdalofugal pathways is it is assessing immediate risk and coming to a decision that run away or fight or flight or whatever, or be happy or whatever. Via the stria terminalis, because this is a longer pathway, it's getting inputs from all of these surrounding structures as well. It's communicating with the hippocampus as it goes. What it's doing is that it is assessing long-term risk. That now that I have activated these systems and I am away from the tiger, do I still need to be keep the fear response going, right? Like we said, emotions persist. One of the characteristics that we said earlier, emotions persist. So when we talk about fear and anxiety, we'll talk about this in more detail. I'm just saying so that you understand the significance of why we are learning this, right? So this is managed by the stria terminalis, which sort of which run parallel to the fornix in this arch, come to rest on the bed nucleus of stria terminalis, and further send projections outward into different structures, right? So that is your stria terminalis. So now that we're talking about the hippocampus, we'll just finish off the main hippocampal pathways as well. So the hippocampus, as you can see here, the hippocampus is just one tiny sort of coiled structure in the bottom of your brain, but it sends out this large output tract, right? So this entire thing that we saw in the cut brain as well, this entire thing is known as the fornix, right? It's an extension of the hypothalamus ka output pathway. Right, so this is your fornix, or also known as the arch, which literally translates to the arch. Within this also there are certain column-like arrangement of neurons that are seen, white matter tracks which are seen. If you remember where the fornix is in the brain, it is just under the corpus callosum, and just above the corpus callosum is your cingulate cortex, right? So this also sends a lot of back and forth from the anterior cingulate cortex, right? So these are known as the pillars of the fornix because the tracks are arranged as a parallel pillar-like fashion. And at the end of it, where the fornix ends, it sends out these finger-like projections outward, again connecting to a lot of these areas, right? So these are known as the fimbriae fornix. Fimbriae you may have heard in different this thing, जैसे fallopian tube में भी बोलते हैं जो end point है fimbriae. Fimbriae just means fingers in Latin. So this is known as the fimbriae fornix, the end part of it, because it is sending these finger-like projections outwards. Okay. So this is the hippocampus and its projections. Another crucial structure that we all talk about a lot is your nucleus accumbens to ventral thalamus. So ये जो septal nuclei है, this basically sends out two pathways, right? So the septal nuclei, so there is one sort of corridor that goes from the septal nuclei into the midbrain. The VTA जो हमने लिखा है, ventral tegmental area, that is in the midbrain, like we saw earlier, right? So the septum sends out this one input from here into the mammillary bodies. Actually, it should be around here. So the midbrain के आसपास ये mammillary body, like we saw, into the mammillary bodies, as well as this same corridor is also used by the ventral tegmental area to send out inputs to the nucleus accumbens. तो ये जो corridor जो बना रखा है इन्होंने, this pathway is known as the medial forebrain bundle. Right. So this is something which is again very important in psychiatry because this is the pathway through which your reward circuitry passes. We'll see about this in a little more detail आगे also, but this is a area for stimulation. This is an area for surgery. This is an area where damage can cause a lot of lesions and all of these things, right? So these are the major pathways. Thalamus, of course, thalamocortical pathways are there. Thalamus sends out radiations into the prefrontal cortex, into the anterior cingulate, right? All of these pathways are also there. Mammillothalamic is also there. The mammillary body sends out radiations into the thalamus. We'll see those smaller pathways in detail later, right? So this is how your limbic structures are connected to each other. As you can see, there is a lot of khichdi that is going on in this tiny area of the brain, right? And it's very difficult to know all of these. So I'll try to put it in context of individual structures so you can remember it slightly better. And we'll talk only about the structures which are of importance to us in terms of psychiatry. Anatomically, there are n number of structures around this. There are n number of variations of this, certain pathways which go here and there. Jiska clinical significance is not known yet. So out of curiosity, if you want to read, I've linked some papers later. You can read about it in great detail. And this is only the anterior limbic structures. More recent evidence has also shown that your posterior structures such as the cerebellum, the occipital lobe also communicate with these limbic structures directly, right? So this is how it is organized. Wait, let me just a second. Can't seem to. Yeah, sorry. This is the habenula, I think, and yeah. So we'll go ahead from here. Let me just clear the board. Okay, so if you put this out, if you map this out on a piece of paper, this is what it looks like. So I'm sure you all understood this. Is this clear now? Shivram, समझ गया?
सर फोर्निक्स वाला पार्ट सर एक बार दोबारा बता दो.
चलो
समझ
अच्छी बात है.
गया.
अगर समझ जाते तो मैं डर जाता अगर याद. ठीक है, तो हम डिटेल में जाएंगे. So we'll try to recreate this part by part, okay, so that we can understand. ठीक है. So we'll go by part. First, we'll talk about the amygdala separately. Okay. So the amygdala is itself divided into two areas, very broad areas. That is the basolateral amygdala and the corticomedial amygdala. ठीक है. एक जो नीचे की तरफ है और lateral है और जो एक ऊपर की तरफ है और medial है. ठीक है. तो very broadly, the basolateral area takes care of the inputs into the amygdala, and the corticomedial also includes the central nucleus of the amygdala. That is something again you'll read a lot about. Manages the efferents, that is the output of the amygdala goes through the corticomedial areas. So what are the inputs that the amygdala needs? First, from the thalamus, basically your amygdalo-thalamic tract hai, So that's why I have written just the names of these parts, because apart from a few of them, they are just named after what they are connecting. Say amygdalothalamic tract ho gaya, for example. Okay, so this sends in all of these sensory. So I mean, if I'm sure you have some idea of the जैसे visual pathway है, auditory pathway है, all of these sort of synapses around the thalamus, and then they are sent into the respective cortices. So right from the thalamus, some parts of this data is directly sent to the amygdala, because we cannot wait for higher cortical processing. Sometimes we need to react immediately to certain stimuli, right? So that is the amygdalothalamic tracts. Then the amygdala also connects to the prefrontal cortex called by something called the uncinate fasciculus. Right? This is also something which has been studied a lot recently, because this is where this जो appraisal component हमने बोला, right? The amygdala has gathered these inputs, and the amygdala also has access to memories of past events, and the actual processing about how much, how little, what emotion, what pattern of arousal that you need to produce, this is calculated in tandem with the prefrontal cortex, right? So this is handled by the uncinate fasciculus. This is a name you have to remember slightly. The cingulate cortex directly sends the temporal lobe. Again, the temporal lobe is directly connecting to the amygdala. The insula is another area which sends. So basically, your visual sensory, your audio visual processing, touch, everything is managed by your thalamus. But your internal sensations, such as visceral sensations, appraisal of the internal state of the body, this is recognized and processed by the insular cortex. So this is also sent forward to the amygdala. When we talk about pain, for example, you'll see that this connection has a major role to play. Jaise if we have a cut somewhere, or something more major, suppose. You also generate a arousal response, a fear response. You want to cover that area, you want to run away from there or whatever, to save yourself from whatever has caused this injury. So this is also managed by, this immediate response is managed by the amygdala again, right? And the ventral tegmental area again for regarding reward, anti-reward, etc. So all of these inputs go into the amygdala, and the corticomedial side, say these two outputs are come out. First is the amygdalofugal pathway that we talked about, that is for rapid response to threat. So this connects to your hypothalamus, your nucleus accumbens, your caudate, which is again your motor circuitry. Caudate and putamen basal ganglia को activate करता है कि जल्दी भागो यहाँ से, या जो भी है, मतलब whatever the response may be. Hypothalamus again to rapidly activate your endocrine response to threats. Septum and nucleus accumbens we'll see later. And the second one, that is your striae terminalis and the bed nucleus of striae terminalis. So this is something which is important to us, right? Because this takes care of long-term assessment of threat and memory of threats, right? So as well as for regulation of potential threats. Suppose you're you're walking home alone at night. Should you be anxious in this situation? What is the situation around me right now? So this will be processed at multiple levels by your hippocampal memory of where you are. Your cortex may calculate possibilities of different things, like what kind of area is it? Is the area well lit or not? Is this an area which is known to be dangerous? Is this an area which is known to be safe? All of this is processed by the amygdala, and via the striae terminalis, this anxiety response is sustained fear response is regulated by this, right? Emotional regulation to threats as well. And this is the site for deep brain stimulation for OCD as well as for depression. Right? So deep brain stimulation for OCD tends to target the bed nucleus of striae terminalis, because a lot of cortical structures are involved. For example, the cingulate cortex is involved, the orbitofrontal cortex is involved. OCD का अगर तुम कभी न्यूरोबायोलॉजी पढ़ो तो उसमें ये सारे areas भी involved है. But the problem with stimulating those areas is that they are also involved in cognition. So the moment you start stimulating them, or you even poke something through them, cognition starts getting affected. So the BNST is this safe zone which is specifically targeting only emotion. Right. So the anxiety response that a person has in OCD can be cut completely. Right. So this term is used, anterior limb of internal capsule, because anatomical landmark wise in an intact brain, internal capsule का anterior limb is what corresponds to this area. मतलब वहां से लैंडमार्क पकड़ के अंदर प्रोब घुसाते हैं. सो ALIC बोलते हैं, and BST, that is bed of striae terminalis. Okay, so this is how the amygdala is connected. Something very, very close to the amygdala is your hippocampus. You can see that in this MRI. So this is a T1 coronal section of the brain. Structural pathology देखने के लिए जो हम Alzheimer's वगैरह में देखना है तो this is the cut that we usually ask for. So this tiny structure here at the end of your temporal lobe, no, this coiled structure that you're seeing here, snail-like coiled structure, this is known as the hippocampus. Hippocampus was named because it apparently looks like a seahorse to whoever discovered it. ये जो curved सा है तो apparently seahorse जैसे लगे. This is a very interesting diagram made by Ramon E. Cajal, who is considered to be the father of neuropathology, way back in the 1600s or something, based on dissection and microscopy, whatever was available at that time. And to date, this is the most detailed diagram of the hippocampus that we have since that wo era se leke abhi tak. This is hand drawn by him, right? So this structure has basically been blown up into a diagrammatic representation. So you can see that there is this coil over here of the hippocampus, and this sort of curves around and directly connects to the rest of your temporal lobe. So this temporal lobe part that is connected here is one of the outflow tracts, and the second is the fornix, that it's not visible on this section. If you see a transverse section, sorry, a sagittal section, you'll see the fornix also emerging from the hippocampus, right? So Cajal also delineated the hippocampus based on histology. Right, so this is known as the dentate gyrus. If you see this part, ये ऐसे अलग से दांत जैसे अटका हुआ है यहाँ पे, so it's known as the dentate gyrus. He labeled these areas as CA3, CA2, and CA1. That is Cornu Amonis. Amonis is some Egyptian god who जिसके बकरी जैसे, has a head of a goat. So he has this curved horn. So because this looks like a curved horn, they named it Cornu Amonis. So CA3, CA2, and CA1, based on the histopathology, these three distinct zones are seen. This connects into this part, that is the main outflow tract of the hippocampus, that is known as the subiculum. Okay, we'll see that it will be written out in the next slide. So this is known as the subiculum, and the part of the temporal lobe that is connected is known as the entorhinal cortex. Okay. Rhinal cortex, because in lower mammals such as rats, for example, this is the area, this part of the temporal lobe, this small section here, is what is primarily responsible for olfaction or smell processing. There are fibers that directly go from the nose, the olfactory receptors, directly to this entorhinal cortex. So when it was discovered in humans as well, the name was kept to be the same, right? So this is the basic organization of the hippocampus, and we'll see. So these are the full forms: the entorhinal cortex, the dentate gyrus, cornu amonis, and subiculum. Right. So now, how are these areas connected within the hippocampus? We need to see. So the dentate gyrus is basically your input area, and the subiculum is basically your output area. Okay. So dentate gyrus gets most of its inputs from the entorhinal cortex, from other structures in the limbic circuitry as well. So this is known as the trisynaptic pathway, because dentate to CA3, CA3 to CA1, and CA1 to subiculum. So these three synapses are seen in this pathway. This is known as the trisynaptic pathway. CA2 बेचारा थोड़ा अकेला रह जाता है हमेशा, because it's a very small area histologically, and people have not really been able to figure out what it does. Especially, there is some talk that it may be involved in social memory processing specifically, but not really known yet in a lot of detail. So what is important is subiculum sends out two output pathways now, right? So one, it sends out without using the fornix that we saw now, directly connecting to the entorhinal cortex. So this will go back directly into the entorhinal cortex, which is carried on further into the prefrontal cortex, as well as these retrosplenial and perirhinal cortices. So these two areas are mainly used for spatial memory processing and organization. When we talk about memory, we'll see about these areas in detail, but also to the prefrontal cortex as well. More important for our current discussion is the fornix pathway.
सर एक बार थोड़ा सा रिपीट करेंगे ये
कौन सा वाला?
ये सबिकुलम से आउटपुट जो निकल रहा है, ये दो टाइप है या फिर
दो पाथवेज है जो निकल रहे हैं बेसिकली. एक बिना फॉर्निक्स को यूज किए जो निकल रहा है, which is directly going into the entorhinal cortex and further into the prefrontal and these other areas, perisplenial, retrosplenial, perirhinal areas in the brain. These two don't think about too much. That has a role in memory processing. We'll see about that some other day, right? The second outflow tract is through the fornix, जो हमने आर्च देखा था वहां पे, और even in my diagram जो हिपोकैम्पस से निकल के आर्च जो जा रहा है, this is primarily what plays a role in your limbic processing. तो fornix के थ्रू जो pathway जाता है, so there is one very good pathway that has been described, that is your mammillary bodies via your mammillothalamic tract into the anterior thalamus, into the cingulum bundle, and back into the entorhinal cortex. So this is known as your Papez circuit. This is one of the first circuits that was delineated in the brain, right? But now we know for a fact that apart from this Papez circuit, the fornix also has outputs into these other areas as well, directly into the hypothalamus, into the nucleus accumbens, and the amygdala as well. Okay, so these are the two main outflow tracts of the hippocampus. Hippocampus, as you know, has a role to play in memory. So in the limbic circuit, its primary role is basically in the past. I encountered some sort of stimulus in the past, and based on the outcome that was there during that stimulus, the hippocampus encodes these memories that this was a good thing, or this is a bad thing, or in certain situation you need to be afraid, you need to be happy, you need to be sad, right? So when this same stimulus is encountered again via the fornicial pathway, it communicates with all these areas and says that, oh, based on I have these memories from the past, this is supposed to be this is a situation where you should be happy. Right? That is the very, very, very rough role of the hippocampus. None of these pathways are unidirectional. All of them are bidirectional. All of them communicate with almost every other part of the limbic system. But this, to make it simple to remember, this is what the hippocampus does in the limbic system, right? और कुछ भी याद ना रहे तो भी at least this basic organization of the hippocampus and the fornix pathway you should know. Okay. Then some other structures which are equally important. The septal nuclei that I talked about earlier. So these are some nuclei which are present behind the genu of the corpus callosum towards the middle of the brain. And it is directly or around the septum pellucidum. So they're just called the septal nuclei. They haven't named them. So the septal nuclei, as we saw earlier, has inputs from both the amygdala as well as the hippocampus. Right? Hippocampus via the fornix and amygdala via the stria terminalis. Right. It also has direct inputs from the midbrain as well. So all of these inputs are sent to the septal nuclei. What the septal nuclei does in animals is very well known. What it does in humans, we are not very sure yet. It is very highly interconnected with a lot of structures, so we assume it is important. But kya karta hai exactly, what role does it play, we are not very sure yet. It seems to play an inhibitory role, ki, like a negative feedback loop for the amygdala, ki amygdala ke amygdalofugal pathways ने stress response activate कर दिया और stria terminalis via septal nuclei is stopping the stress response. Some have theorized about this, but exactly हमें पता नहीं है septal nuclei का क्या role है. In fact, it was discovered in humans also much later. One of the pathways that we know well is the connection to the habenula. So this is another small structure present around the thalamus. It connects via something called the striae habenularis. Basically, it's just a pathway which is going to the habenula. So what the habenula does is that the habenula is again an area which has been found to be important in anxiety, specifically for us. Okay, the other area for stimulation in OCD, in day brain stimulation, is the habenula. Right. So habenula also seems to have a role to play in anxiety. So what the habenula does is that it sends out a track to the interpeduncular nuclei. That's a part of the midbrain. जो cerebellar peduncles होते हैं, if you remember, उसके बीच में से जो path nuclei है, which further synapse onto the raphe nuclei. And raphe nuclei, as we all know, is the primary serotonin producing nuclei in the brain. So जो serotonin decrease होता है जो anxiety में, the habenula is thought to play a role in this. Right. So again, something that we'll talk about in detail when we're talking about fear and stress and anxiety in general, but just for your orientation, this is there. So from this, like we said, there's something called the medial forebrain bundle, which is sort of like a pipeline that is emerging from the septal nuclei. तो इसमें से दो structures जाते हैं. एक तो है जो septal nuclei से mammillary body जाते हैं, which again synapse onto the anterior thalamus. What this does, again, we have no idea. But it seems to play some role in the it has come out to be positive multiple in functional neuroimaging studies and all. This has been shown to be significant. That's why I'm just mentioning it. This is your mammillothalamic tract also, which you may have heard of. So this is one pathway. What is more relevant for us is that this is also the bundle through which the ventral tegmental area nucleus accumbens communicate to each other, which is your primary reward pathway. Okay. And the mammillary bodies also communicate to the ventral tegmental area as well. So it may have a role to play in reward. It may have a role to play in memory. जैसे Wernicke's NKF में तुमने देखा कि mammillary bodies are hyper intense and memory disturbances are seen. So we don't know how they're related exactly, but it seems to play a role. Right. So these are the other structures that are involved in the limbic circuitry. Okay. So now we'll try to put it all together again. Right, sorry. Ignore that complicated image again. So I've tried to recreate this step by step so you can understand. So I would like you guys to participate in this, right? So this is the organization. This is the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, cingulate gyrus running under it, the thalamus somewhere around the near the center of the brain, hypothalamus under the thalamus, and the midbrain under that as well. Hippocampus, parahippocampal gyrus is sort of running around this entire thing. So I've just shown it as a line here. In सबके आगे, like towards quite close to the prefrontal cortex is your amygdala. Your nucleus accumbens is even further closer to the prefrontal cortex, and the basal ganglia, just as a group, I've just labeled here. I mean, it tends to, the basal ganglia has multiple parts of that. I've just, as a representation, I've shown here. So we'll start from the amygdala. तो आप लोग बताओ amygdala के कहाँ क्या क्या तुम्हें याद है अभी जितना मैंने बोला उसमें से.
सर अमिगडाला फ्यूगल पाथवेज सबको कनेक्ट कर रहा है.
हाँ, तो पहले हम अमिगडालोफ्यूगल पाथवेज को बना देंगे इसमें. अच्छा, पहले बिफोर दैट we'll just get these basic connections out of there कि thalamus connects to both to the cortices. ठीक है, thalamocortical fibers है और anterior thalamic radiation है जो frontal cortex के साथ cingulate gyrus के साथ thalamus सबसे connect करता है. These are intermediate pathways for a lot of communication, so I've shown them. तो जैसे आपने बोला तो अमिगडालोफ्यूगल में से सबसे पहले जो है हमारा अमिगडालो थैलेमिक ट्रैक्ट एक सेपरेट होता है. मैंने दिखाया इसमें जो इनपुट आ रहा है अमिगडाला फ्रॉम ऑल ऑफ दी सेंटर्स जो हमने बोला था ना. सो दैट इज योर अमिगडालो थैलेमिक ट्रैक्ट एंड दिस इज द अनसिनेट fasciculus which is connecting it to the prefrontal cortex. ये जो अप्रेजल ऑफ इमोशंस जो करना है ये जंक्शन में हो रहा है, और जो के बाहर हो क्या रहा है भाई, वो इनपुट तुम्हें थैलेमस अमिगडालो थैलेमिक ट्रैक्ट के थ्रू दे रहा है. ठीक है, तो इसके बाद जैसे आपने बोला अमिगडालोफ्यूगल ट्रैक्ट है विच कनेक्ट्स टू ऑलमोस्ट एवरीथिंग. ठीक है, बीएनएसटी को भी कनेक्ट कर रहा है, हाइपोथैलेमस मैमलरी बॉडी को कनेक्ट कर रहा है, बेसल गैंग्लिया, न्यूक्लियस अकम्बेंस, ये जो रैपिड रिस्पांस पाथवे है. ठीक है, इसके अलावा क्या था अमिगडाला से बाहर निकलता हुआ? Stria terminalis, right. So the stria terminalis is the longer pathway which has connections to all of these surrounding structures: prefrontal cortex, frontal cortex, हिपोकैम्पस, पैराहिपोकैम्पल गायरस, इन सब से टच कर करके फाइनली जाके बेड न्यूक्लियस और स्ट्राया टर्मिनालिस में अपना आउटपुट दे रहा है. ठीक है, एंड वाया द सेप्टल न्यूक्लिया इट इज कम्युनिकेटिंग विद द रेस्ट ऑफ द स्ट्रक्चर्स लेटर. ठीक है, सो दिस इज योर अमिगडालर पाथवेज दैट यू डिस्क्राइब्ड. नेक्स्ट वील कम टू योर हिपोकैम्पल पैराहिपोकैम्पल एरियाज. तो हिपोकैम्पस का क्या बताया था, इनपुट कहाँ से आता है?
एंटोराइनल कॉर्टेक्स सर.
एंटोराइनल कॉर्टेक्स से. तो एंटोराइनल कॉर्टेक्स से इनपुट आता है एंड आउटपुट जाता है वाया योर नॉन फॉर्निक्स पाथवे. हम उड़ा देते हैं अभी के लिए, वो लिम्बिक सिस्टम के लिए रेलेवेंट नहीं है इतना. फॉर्निक्स पाथवे पे फोकस करते हैं. तो ये जो ग्रीन में मैंने बनाया है दैट इज योर एंटायर पापेज सर्किट हियर. ठीक है, कि सिंगुलेट गायरस के नीचे जो बंडल है वो दैट इज द सिंगुलम बंडल. बेसिकली इज जस्ट कनेक्टिंग द सिंगुलेट गायरस टू द स्ट्रक्चर्स अंडर इट. जस्ट अ स्मॉल, आई मीन इट्स क्वाइट अ लार्ज व्हाइट मैटर ट्रैक्ट बट दैट इज द सिंगुलम बंडल. ठीक है, तो सिंगुलेट गायरस से वाया यहाँ पे एंटोराइनल कॉर्टेक्स वगैरह आएगा साइड में, वहां से इसको इनपुट जा रहा है. दिस इज फर्दर कम्युनिकेटिंग विद द अमिगडाला. इट इज सेंडिंग आउट ये जो तुम्हारा फॉर्निक्स का आर्च है दैट इज टचिंग ऑल ऑफ दी स्ट्रक्चर, सेप्टल न्यूक्लिया, बीएनएसटी, सबको टच करके फॉर्निक्स इज फाइनली गोइंग इनटू योर mammillary body. Mammillary body से it is going into your thalamus, that is your mammillothalamic pathway. Thalamus से it goes back into the cortical areas through these thalamocortical fibers, anterior thalamic radiations. इन सब से frontal cortex, cingulate gyrus से बात करता है ये, it communicates and the output is sent back through the cingulate gyrus back to the hippocampus. So this is your basic memory loop and emotional memory specifically का जो loop है तुम्हारा. So this is your some parts of your Papez circuit. A Papez circuit had fewer structures than this. Also, I have combined the hypothalamus and mammillary body because although anatomically it is different, fiber-wise it is difficult to say which is which exactly, what fibers are going where because they're very close to each other. ठीक है, तो अब बच क्या गया है हमारे पास? सेप्टल न्यूक्लिया के कनेक्शन पे आते हैं. सेप्टल न्यूक्लिया का क्या बताया था, कहाँ का कनेक्शन रहता है?
अमिगडाला, हिपोकैम्पस एंड मिड ब्रेन से सर कनेक्शन आता है.
मिड ब्रेन से रहता है. एक जो मैंने स्पेसिफिक बोला था ना, जो एंजाइटी के लिए स्पेसिफिक तुम्हें याद रखना है,
हैबेनुला सर.
habenula के साथ. ठीक है, so this is the stria habenularis. So septal nucleus sends an output to the habenula and habenula further sends an output to the midbrain. Midbrain है जहाँ पे तुम्हारा raphe nuclei है. ठीक है, interpeduncular nucleus है that communicates to the raphe nuclei and वहाँ से serotonin release control करता है इसे. ठीक है. So this is one of the most well delineated paths we have for serotonin control in the brain. That's why I'm focusing on this a lot. And in anxiety, fear, all of these specifically this pathway has been shown to be hyper or hypoactive respectively. ठीक है. सेप्टल न्यूक्लियस से दूसरे हमने बोले थे जो है तुम्हारा मीडियल फोर ब्रेन बंडल. तो इसमें से एक है जो डायरेक्ट सेप्टल न्यूक्लियस से हाइपोथैलेमस मैमिलरी बॉडी में जा रहा है, एंड दूसरा अभी वो साथ में नहीं दिखा सकता, सेम कलर में मैंने दिखा है, जो रिवॉर्ड पाथवे है तुम्हारा न्यूक्लियस अकम्बेंस से लेके मिड ब्रेन तक. ठीक है. सो दिस इज rough approximation of what the limbic system looks like. Now do you have any doubts after this? तो पूछो, मतलब I'll try to explain again.
Yes, okay.
सर एक क्वेश्चन है
जी.
ये जो सर पैपेज सर्किट है, उसके बाद जो हम लिम्बिक सिस्टम का जो हम सर्किट बनाते हैं
हम्म.
वो कैसे डेवलप हुआ, मतलब कैसे कैसे हिस्टोरिकली हमने क्या क्या ऐड करते गए, कैसे कैसे हमें मिला?
तो पैपेज जो है उसने अराउंड 1800 किसी में सम टाइम इन द 1800s ही डिलिनेटेड दिस वन पाथवे, दिस हिपोकैम्पस टू मैमिलरी बॉडी टू थैलेमस टू फ्रंटल लोब एंड बैक, ये जो लूप है. तो ही पोस्टुलेटेड दैट जो हमारा मेमोरी एंड इमोशन है दैट इज कंट्रोल्ड बाय दिस एरिया स्पेसिफिकली. This loop is what is taking care of all this. How it is taking care वगैरह, of course it was beyond their they didn't have the capabilities then to say why exactly or how exactly. Much later, almost I think 100 years later, 1900s में कभी तो मैकलीन came and said that ये सारे जो न्यूक्लियर है, all of these are involved in emotional processing. He also did not say how these are involved. He just said that ये जो सारे तुम्हारे स्ट्रक्चर्स मैंने बनाए हैं ये सारे भी लिम्बिक सर्किटरी में आने चाहिए. एंड ही इज द गाय हु गेव द टर्म लिम्बिक सिस्टम ना. तो मकलीन आल्सो नेवर रियली सेड हाउ दीस कनेक्शंस हैपन, एक्सेप्ट फॉर अ फ्यू ऑफ कोर्स जो मेजर बड़े कनेक्शंस है वो उसने डिस्क्राइब किए. एंड following this, another gentleman, some name with a Y, I can't remember, I'll get back to you on that, he added further saying that the frontal cortex also has a role to play in the limbic system. Now, so this is how our understanding of the limbic system has evolved, not how the limbic system has evolved. Limbic system was always like this. हमारा understanding ऐसे evolve हुआ है उसका. एंड ये जो मैंने आर्टिकल जो साइट किया है इसमें अगर तुम देखोगे तो और भी बहुत ज्यादा डिटेल में उन्होंने बताया है इसके बारे में. Anyone else? Devishri, you were asking something, I think.
Yeah, so you'd mentioned in the habenula, so it goes to like two, like the track basically goes to two places. So one is the raphi nuclei, right? So we're doing primary inhibition or like zone for serotonin production. And then what was the other place that it's going to?
No, it is going to the raphi nuclei. In between there is a sort of stop by called the interpeduncular nucleus. It's okay if
Okay,
you
so probably
don't,
not relevant. Okay.
Yeah, I mean it is, yeah, not really clinically relevant, I guess. Surgically it is relevant, so I mentioned it just as a.
Okay.
Because
there was another like
yeah, please.
So I think a couple of years ago they studied like the brains of cab drivers in London, and they figured that they had bigger hypothalamus. I'm sure it's a very common like study.
Yeah.
It's a lot of like cited studies. So I'm guessing that had something to do with like the formex, so not the non-formex area, which is what increases in like cab drivers, because that controls visual,
spatial memory
but not,
related
like,
areas they said have expanded in the cab drivers, they say. That we'll see when we talk about those specific functions, memory and fear वगैरह. जैसे amygdalas have been shown to be larger in patients with borderline personality disorder or with PTSD, for example. The amygdala is larger.
Yeah, that was in IABP also, like the guest speaker. That's what he gave his guest lecture on.
So that we'll see when we're talking about individual emotions and their pathologies. So I just want to focus on this is the basic connectivity of the limbic system. You should know what these structures are talking to each other about, because otherwise when you talk about fear में amygdala has a role, habenula has a role, it sounds like you're saying the same things repeatedly. हर चीज में हर चीज involved है ऐसा लगता है, महसूस होता है. तो you need to have an idea about what these things are doing, or at least our current understanding of what these things are doing in the brain. ठीक है. Anyone else has any doubts? First years especially.
Sir, what is the primary role of the Pepe circuit? Like, Is it the memory or the regulation of emotions?
Both.
Both primary.
Because it is difficult to separate memory from, that's what I was saying, ki emotion is so ingrained in almost everything we do that it is difficult to separate out emotion from anything that we are doing. Even if you are remembering something, for example, you're focusing on the memory of, say, your house. Are you not also having emotional responses to that? Or you're focusing
Yes.
on the memory of something very mundane also, like you know, uh, some formula that you remembered in childhood. That also brings forth some emotions when you're thinking about it, right? It could be just तुम पाइथागोरस थ्योरम याद कर रहे हो, पर पाइथागोरस थ्योरम याद करते करते तुम्हें वो चीजें भी याद आएंगी, हाँ, like the last time I remembered this was for so and so, or you're trying to remember it out of a state of anxiety, कि shit, I need to remember this right now, right? So almost everything that we do in terms of motivation, in terms of cognition, also has a component of emotion attached to it. It is very difficult to separate out memory from emotion. In fact, memories that are more strongly emotionally balanced are stored also and remembered also much better. Like traumatic memories, for example, because they had such a significant fear response or anxiety response at the time of the formation of memory. The recap of those things is also much better. जैसे flashbacks जो होते हैं PTSD में, मतलब इतना विविड रिकैपिचुलेशन हो रहा है वो मेमोरी का, है ना? बट वॉलंटरली हम नहीं कर पाते, एग्जाम में तो हमसे नहीं हो पाता इतना, मतलब फ्लैशबैक तो नहीं आता टेक्स्ट बुक का तुम्हारे, है ना? तो whatever emotions are, whatever memories are also associated with a high emotional balance are better remembered as well. The other part, that is the non-fornix pathway, has more to do with, like Devishri was saying, visuospatial memories, which doesn't really have to do much with emotion, but with things like how things are oriented in space, right? Like if I, जैसे मैं अगर ओपीडी आने के लिए थर्ड फ्लोर पे सीढ़ियाँ चढ़ के गया, तो मेरे मन में है कि किस तरफ ओपीडी है, किस तरफ वार्ड है, आरटीएमएस के लिए मुझे कहाँ जाना है, 328 कहाँ है, 336 कहाँ है, और व्हेन यू आर ट्राइंग टू navigate on the road कि तुम पहली बार कहीं गए हो, दूसरी बार यू आर ट्राइंग टू री-navigate those areas. So that is where visuospatial, or rather spatial memory, temporal memory, all of these come into play. Those don't really have, I mean, have less to do with emotions than ये जो episodic memory है हमारा, ठीक है? There is also some amount of this thing that the ventral areas of the fornix and the hippocampal pathways have more to do with memories, and the dorsal areas have less to do with memories. I mean, with emotion, sorry. That is also one of the theories out there, but again, not very well established. और कोई? कौशिक, तुम भी हो क्या इसमें? दिख रहे हो तुम?
Kshitij, I had a doubt.
हाँ, श्रेयस, yeah.
Remembering these circuits, how important it is in actually helping patients regulate emotions, or is it more about something else?
I'll come to how it is useful in regulating emotions. I'll come to that right after this.
Sure, sure.
Okay, so we'll move ahead. I mean, I know it's complicated. It'll take a few tries for you to remember it. I've tried to make this simpler compared to what is given online. So this is the entire diagram that they have quoted in the paper. So this is the posterior limbic circuitry as well. So there's a lot more tracks in this as well. ये dorsoroubrodentatothalamic tract है, posterior thalamic radiation, occipito-parietal hypothalamic radiations hai. There is a lot more to this. If you read this article that I've cited, I've given it in the end also. If you want to learn in more detail, you can go into this. But this part is so new that we don't really know what they do exactly. We just know that in certain conditions, in certain emotions, these have been found to be significant. So I don't want to focus too much on that because that will make things very complicated. So at least this front part of the circuit, you should try to remember. And if you have to make it in your exam, then I think it will be easier to make it separated out. कि amygdala का जो initial slides है, that will be probably be a better idea to make. Unless you go to the exam with, I think 6 or 7 different colors that I've used here, which some people do. So you can try that also. Okay. So, right. So forget this. Ignore this for now. So, Yeah, so another concept that we'll keep coming back to when we're talking about specific emotions is that there is a great degree of overlap in emotional processing. ये जो हमने, remember when I told you about the levels of processing, when we're talking about brain areas, it is not a very accurate way to think about any cognitive process or psychological phenomena, because multiple areas are involved in the same thing, right? So this is a very good diagram I found from this article. They've sort of represented the emotions using these colors. So you can see, like, for example, the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, the insula, the brainstem, the thalamus have a role in almost all emotions. There are only a few, such as the ventral pallidum, that is basically where your nucleus accumbens is. That has a role only with pleasure, for example. Or the BNST has a role with social emotion and anxiety, for example. Ventral tegmental area again with social emotion and anger, for example. So there are very few areas which have only to do with one or two emotions. Most of them do take care of everything, right? So how do you put all of this together, like the theory that we saw earlier, as well as the neurobiology that we've gone through now, right? So this is the core concept that I want to take away from this class today. So this was the conceptual act theory. I've just extended it a little more for neatness. That there is a stimulus, you appraise the stimulus, right? Based on your memory, based on calculation, simulation, whatever your brain is, your frontal cortex, and whatever areas are doing that. What is this something that how should I react to the stimulus, or what kind of stimulus is this rather? This is further processed into a valence arousal categorization that we mentioned, that we saw, that four-sided graph, that circular graph that we saw, that the brain encodes a certain valence, positive versus negative, with some spectrum in between, and hyperarousal versus hypoarousal with some spectrum in between. And this is further, the awareness of this is our cognition of the emotion, and this further activates your affective circuitry for that specific emotion, which coordinates your response, right? And now what we have added to this from your neurobiology that we've learned is that the appraisal of stimulus and valence arousal categorization is managed by your amygdala, hippocampus, and cortex, right? You need the memory of past events, the processing of these various inputs that are there, and the amygdala directly plays a role in your appraisal, right? So this is one loop. तो amygdala hippocampus हो गए तुम्हारे amygdalofugal pathways, amygdala cortex हो गया तुम्हारा uncinate fasciculus जो है, right? So this is one part of the limbic system that takes care of this. Second is the cognition. This is managed predominantly by your insula, dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, and the prefrontal cortex again. Like we saw, the DACC is something which is in touch with the entire limbic system. So whatever changes are happening in the limbic system, whether there is an increase in serotonin, whether there's an increase in dopamine, there's everything in between, what level of increase, what level of decrease. The subjective experience of this is managed by your insula, your DACC, and the prefrontal cortex again, right? Ki, how do you know that? Very simply we say that dopamine बढ़ गया तो reward मिलता है. तो ये reward का जो sensation है, this connection of dopamine has increased, so this my subjective perception of reward comes from these centers. Then the core affect will, I mean, these centers will activate your specific circuitry. We'll see that in detail when we study specific circuitry. And finally, your response is mediated by your HP axis and your motor system, right? So this is how emotion in general acts, whatever emotion it may be. If you subtract the specific motor responses and the specific axis responses to it and the specific circuitry, this is what your skeletal structure of emotional response looks like, right? There is an appraisal of stimulus and categorization of it by these structures. Then the subjective feeling that we get of this categorization as well as internal state is your cognition, that is handled by these structures, core affect by these specific circuitry, and response by your HP axis and motor system. This is also the framework on which we base our interventions, right? Now suppose a person has anxiety disorder, so you may want to start therapy with this patient, for example. What do you do in therapy? Say very basic, you take cognitive behavioral therapy ले लिया तुमने. So you try to assess that why is this person feeling anxious in all these situations, right? So what is going wrong is that this person is when they are sitting in a non-threatening environment, they are still, even these non-threatening stimuli are appraised as fearful or anxiety inducing by the person's brain. So that is managed by these areas. So when you do cognitive restructuring or when you do CBT, for example, you try to logic out these cognitive errors that the person is making. You are trying to act on this arm of the emotional system. Second is the cognition of these uh, uh, internal or external states that are happening. So this has a role in disorders like somatoform disorder, for example. A person is actually feeling sad, for example. They may have something has happened internally, externally. किसी के साथ झगड़ा हो गया. The normal response to that is sadness, right? The person is in a state of low arousal and or yeah, most likely low arousal as well as negative valence. But something is wrong in the cognitive process here, whereas where this, instead of being labeled as an emotion of sadness, it is being labeled as pain, for example, or as dizziness, for example, or whatever n number of things that you see in somatoform disorders, pain probably being the most common, right? So this means that there is some sort of disruption in your insular DACC PFC loops, right? So again, you can do a sort of cognitive restructuring to bring this to cognitive awareness for the patient, that what you're feeling is not actually somatic pain, but it is actually emotional pain that you're unable to label for whatever reason. This categorization may have gone wrong from childhood itself. This categorization is based on your social uh, learning, basically, that जब बच्चा रो रहा है, जब बच्चे से कुछ छीन लिया गया और बच्चा को कुछ मिला नहीं, and the child is in this state of arousal and crying, it is we who tell the child, oh, you're angry right now, what you're feeling right now is called anger, and these are the ways that you can show anger, these are the ways that you can deal with anger. Whereas if somebody, whenever they are sad or since childhood maybe, they are never really given this social learning, or something has gone significantly wrong in their psychological development, where this link between what is socially accepted or what is socially construed as sadness is not really made. So the focus instead is on the physiological symptoms of sadness. So instead of perceiving it as sadness, they perceive it as pain or whatever else. This is also the areas which are targeted now in your neuromodulation techniques. For example, RTMS for somatoform disorders targets the insula. Craving, for example, that's something else. When you're in a reward deficient state from substance use, for example, there is a decrease in your dopamine. So this is perceived, this stimulus is appraised, this internal stimulus ho gaya, this is appraised and said that this means that something is wrong. You've always been taught that you want to be in a reward state, not in a reward deficient state. So all of your panic, anxiety, all these mechanisms are activated. And the cognition that is given for this, that once, wherever this state is awakened, this patient has realized that if I drink again, this goes down. So now, instead of the cognition that this is a withdrawal state by his memories or whatever, the link is formed that when you are in this state, you need to drink. So this cognition changes from distress to craving now, that I need to put this drug in my system and that will reduce this, right? Again, the insula, the DACC are targets for neuromodulation in सब्सटेंस यूज डिसऑर्डर्स एज वेल. जो निकोटीन का वगैरह तुमने देखा रहेगा ना, जो H7 coils है, जो helmet coils are there. I mean, if you've seen pictures of it or whatever, those target the deeper structures that are these structures. Affects specific circuitry, we'll see later. Affects specific circuitry involves all of your neurotransmitters, basically. What are the neurotransmitters that are involved in sadness versus anxiety? What pattern of neurotransmitter response is seen? What pattern of network dysregulation is seen? Which areas of the brain seem to be hyper or hypoactive? And based on that, again, we tailor treatments. Now we are going more into biological treatments, right? Either neuromodulation for those specific areas which seem to show disturbances, like DLPFC, for example, for depression has been very well established now. Okay, you stimulate the DLPFC, it improves depressive symptoms. Or medications that we give are again based on the circuitries that you're giving SSRIs, because based on this person's emotional symptoms, you say that this might probably help this patient. And last is response, that is your HP axis and motor system. Again, this is something that you can work on, that is primarily worked on in your behavioral therapies. Right, response modulation is something that you work on, or even in addiction. Like once the craving sets in, we try to modulate the person's response to this emotion. Right, instead of taking the substance, you teach them something like earth surfing, distraction, drinking. The 4Ds that we talk about for relapse prevention, or to regulate your motor response in reverse. Like this entire cycle can also happen in reverse. Again, we'll see that in fear and anxiety, that there is this is a feedback loop. The response further causes appraisal of this stimuli कि अब जो response हो गया उसका भी appraisal होने वाला है कि oh now my heart is beating faster, so now I need, so there is something is still wrong in my body, I need to be more anxious about it, and this loop sometimes feeds into something like a panic attack. So you can modify the responses. You teach patients something like deep breathing exercises or JPMR, for example, square breathing, all of these things. All of these basically try to regulate the response that a person has to their emotion, right? Or when a person is angry and they want to, go and punch someone, you may teach them some other regulatory techniques. You go, no, instead of going punching someone, you go home and punch a pillow, right? So you're modulating their response, right? So this is how this neurobiological circuitry that we know right now, as well as the psychological phenomena that we observe directly, sort of tend to interact. Okay. Response also includes the HP axis as well. So there has been a lot of research into medications which directly affect the HP axis. Plus other conditions which cause overactivation of the HP axis, like metabolic syndrome is something that is quite commonly described. It also causes abnormal cortisol release, which triggers the HP axis in reverse. Right? This can be appraised by the body as a state of negative affect, right? And this may further fuel depression or anxiety or whatever, right? So this entire thing works as a loop with each other, with each other's systems as well as each phenomena as well. Okay, so are you guys clear on this part?
Yes, sir.
First years?
Yes, sir.
ठीक है, तो next time if somebody asks you what is the theory of emotion, you say that yeah, there were these old theories, but this is the one that is the currently accepted and most widely studied, as well as which directly correlates with your neurobiology as well. Okay, so this is the reading list for this. If you want to read about these circuits in more detail, I would recommend these first two papers at least. The last one is a book that I had talked about earlier, Damasio AR, that is Descartes' Error. It's a very interesting book about how emotion and cognition sort of interact. Okay, so that's it for today. If you have any more doubts, then please let me know.